meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it. Is that clear? You think you've merely stopped a business deal? That is not the case. The Arabs have taken billions of dollars out of this country, and now they must put it back. It is ebb and flow, tidal gravity. It is ecological balance. You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, Reichmarks, Rins, rubles, pounds, and shekels. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things today. That is the atomic and subatomic and galactic structure of things today. And you have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone. Am I getting through to you, Mr. Beale? You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. What do you think the Russians talk about in their councils of state? Karl Marx? They get out their linear programming charts, statistical decision theories, Minimax solutions, and compute the price-cost probabilities of their transactions and investments, just like we do. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime. And our children will live, Mr. Beale, to see that perfect world in which there's no war or famine, oppression or brutality. One vast and ecumenical holding company for whom all men will work to serve a common profit, in which all men will hold a share of stock, all necessities provided, all anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused. And I have chosen you, Mr. Beale, to preach this evangel.
Why me?
Because you're on television, dummy. 60 million people watch you every night of the week, Monday through Friday.
I have seen the face of God.
You just might be right, Mr. Beale.
Well, what happens, let's say a company has a bad quarter and they announce layoffs. And they're not going to take the time to sort through everybody properly by merit. They're going to do it fairly, which means easily, and without too much controversy. And they're just going to arbitrarily select people to lay off. Well, what happens? In most institutions, a small proportion of the people do the vast majority of the genuine work. That's a law called Price's Law. So the square root of the number of people involved do half the work. So if you took a discipline of science and there was 100 people in that subspecialty, 10 of them would write 50% of the publications. Okay, those are people typically who have options, right? Because they're on top of it, man. They're smart, they're conscientious, they're working 70 hours a week.
They can get another gig.
They can get another gig real fast, and maybe one that pays more. And so as soon as the thing gets shaky, it's like the good people go away, because why wouldn't they? The idea that you're made for happiness is not going to be of much comfort under those circumstances. And so Solzhenitsyn's point was, you're weakened by your belief that life is for happiness, because that philosophy cannot sustain any sustained challenge, and you will for sure encounter such a sustained challenge. I don't think that modern people can believe in virtue, but not easily, because virtue sounds religious in a sense, and we have real trouble, whether we're religious or not, with religious preconceptions, because our scientific forms of knowledge and our fundamental materialism has really radically undermined our ability to believe in any transcendent being. But one thing that modern people can believe in, I think, without much difficulty at all, is evil. Solzhenitsyn said, for example, that the most important event of the 20th century, as far as he was concerned, was the Nuremberg judgment. And you may know, you should know, that after World War II, a group of National Socialists from Germany, who were deemed particularly responsible for the absolute horrors of the final solution and the mass factory genocide that accompanied it, were put on trial. And a standard defense for their actions was, well, I was ordered to do it. And the Nuremberg decision denied human beings, regardless of their ethnicity or national background or beliefs, the legal right to use that as a defense under certain limited circumstances. And the argument was, there are some things that are so self-evidently not good, not virtuous, that if you engage in them, you're existentially guilty. You're guilty outside the bounds of your culture. There's a transnational and transethnic morality. We don't know what it is, but we know what it isn't. It isn't pointless torture and genocide. At minimum, to be virtuous is to live your life in such a way that the probability that you would engage in such actions, given the opportunity, is minimized. Now, people think, well, they're already doing that, because if they were in Nazi Germany, they would have been a rescuer, not a perpetrator, but that's wrong. You could take this audience and put them back in 1939 or thereabouts, and 90% of you would, 95% of you, 99% of you, would either be in the perpetrator class or the going along with the perpetrator class. And you may sit and believe that you'd be in the 1%, maybe you would, because how do I know? But that isn't how the historical facts sort themselves out. And it turns out that it's not that difficult generally to put people in a situation, normal people, where they'll do something that really doesn't look very good. Those of you who are familiar with psychology know about the Milgram experiments, for example, know about the Zimbardo prison experiments. You take perfectly normal college students and put them into a situation that they know is a dramatic farce, they know isn't real, give some of them the power of prison guards and make some others arbitrarily into prisoners, and in 3 days you have to shut the whole experiment down because the prison guards have turned into Nazis and they're enjoying torturing the prisoners, even though they know, whatever know means, that they're innocent. Well, that says something about the manner in which people conduct their existence. They're very susceptible to malevolent action. If you look at Genesis, a very old book and very influential book, there's a strange sequence of events that befalls Adam and Eve, right? It's in 2 sentences. A snake gives them an apple, and that wakes them up. Well, there's a good book by a Southern California primatologist that was just published last year that suggests that the reason that humans have such great vision, way better than most animals except for raptors, birds, is because our visual systems were designed to detect predatory snakes. And the way she discovered that was by comparing the populations of predatory snakes around the world to the visual acuity of the primate groups that lived in those areas. And what she found was essentially a one-to-one correspondence. Our visual system, which is the ability to see and to be enlightened, let's say, because enlightenment, for example, is associated with vision, the snake gave that to us because we had to pay attention to predatory things that were after us for tens of millions of years. And fruit, that's interesting. We have color vision because we were fruit eaters. Our color vision is precisely evolved to detect ripe fruit. So that part of the story is right. There's a story that involves women too, but I'm not going to tell that one today. You have to be awake to outsmart women. That's the story. And so that's why they're tangled in there with the serpents and the fruit. And what happens when Adam and Eve wake up? Well, it's a series of strange things. The first thing that happens is the scales fall from their eyes so they can see. All of a sudden they're awake in a way they weren't before. And the next thing that happens is they realize they're naked. Now, one of the things that people have nightmares about is being naked on a stage, which is often why when you see people on a stage, they don't tell you anything they think. Because they don't only not want to be physically naked, they don't want to be metaphysically naked either. And they protect themselves from the inquiring eyes of the audience. No one likes to be naked on stage. Why? Well, to be naked is to have your defenses stripped from you. When the Soviets wanted to really torture the hell out of you at 2 o'clock in the morning, they'd stave in your door, and then they'd strip you and shave you when they got you to prison, because once you were exposed in all your suffering catastrophe, then you were much easier to torture. To be naked, to realize you're naked, is to realize that you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable. That's why Adam and Eve immediately cover themselves up, right? They realize they're naked, they cover themselves up. It's a story about culture. Once people woke up and realized their limitations, their mortal limitations, which is also their knowledge of death, the first thing they do is cover themselves up. And the second thing that happens is they know the difference between good and evil. And that's a strange thing. It's not good and bad. It's good and evil specifically. It's also something that animals don't know. And I thought about this really for 20 years. What does that mean? And then earlier this year, I think I figured it out. I think what it means is you don't know how to torture people until you realize that you're vulnerable. As soon as you're self-conscious of your own vulnerability, then you can take what might only be a predatory act, say on the part of a wolf, because a wolf will bring down a moose or something like that and eat it, and drag that out into 3 months of artistic torturing. And so that means that your recognition of your own vulnerability immediately allows you to determine what's evil. Well, so then you might ask yourself, well, under what conditions would you be likely to manifest that drive? Well, I think that's easy to figure out if you watch yourself. You know, if you watch yourself without presupposition, which means to watch yourself honestly, or to watch yourself as if you're someone you don't know, because you don't know yourself, because you're too complicated to know yourself anyway, so you might as well just come right out and know that. I mean, one of the things that's kind of useful about recognizing your capacity for evil, if you can do that without traumatizing yourself, is that it's the pathway to recognizing your ability for good. You don't get to one without the other, because you have no idea what you're like before you know how terrible you can be. And not only that, you won't take yourself sufficiently seriously. If you know you're a loaded weapon and an unstable loaded weapon, then you're much more likely to pay attention to what you do. But that means you're not particularly nice. And it means that if you were given the opportunity, maybe you would have been a Nazi prison guard. Now, in Genesis, the first thing that happens after Adam and Eve wake up is they have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain, who's Abel's brother, he doesn't get along very well with God. Now, I don't really care if you believe in God, because I don't know what people mean when they say they believe in God anyways, but the story goes that Cain doesn't get along very well with God. And the reason for that is Cain keeps doing things, and they don't work. Everything Cain touches turns to ash, whereas his brother Abel, God likes him, God only knows why, and everything goes real well for Abel. And so Cain is kind of a failure. And Abel's a smashing success, and not only is he successful at everything he does, but he's a good guy too, which is really rude, because if you're really successful at things, you should at least be wretched interpersonally so that people can forgive you. So Cain takes this for, a decade or two, and then he's just had it. He's had it with God. He thinks, how could God make this sort of universe where I'm, breaking myself in half here and getting nowhere, and my brother's doors open for him left, right, and center. So he goes and complains to God. He says, look, what's going on here? What sort of reality did you conjure up here? Abel has it good. I'm having a miserable time. Maybe you should do something about that. And you think that's pretty interesting, that Cain would think that, because you have to ask yourself, what sort of presumption does Cain have to assume that the dismal quality of his being is attributable to God? Because what Cain does in that instant is to make himself the judge of being. And I would say that you should be cautious about making yourself the judge of being, because there's always the possibility that there's a few things that you don't know. So God sort of lets Cain in on the secret. He says, look, the fact that you're suffering miserably away actually isn't my fault. It's your fault. He says to Cain, sin crouches at the door like a predatory cat ready to jump on you, but if you wanted to, you could overcome it. This is not what Cain wants to hear. Cain wants to hear that he's an innocent character and he has nothing to do with his own misery and it's all God's fault. And God says instead, straighten the hell up. You know you could do it. And even though you know you could do it, you won't. And so that's that for Cain. He was upset when he first went into the discussion, but after he got this little piece of news that his suffering was to be laid at his own doorstep, then he's out of the realm of human, and the story says his countenance falls, which means he's angry and upset. And the first thing he does is run off and kill Abel. Why? Well, it's revenge. Right? Abel is God's favorite, and Cain has already judged being and found it wanting, and the best way that he can express his desire for revenge is to find someone who's having a pretty good time of it and to arbitrarily eliminate them. And it might be of some interest to note that one of Cain's grandchildren is the first person who makes weapons of war. So that brilliant little story so long ago associates the moral failings of the resentful individual who's unwilling to take responsibility for the nature of their own being directly with atrocious acts of social conflict. And that's another thing to know, because if you're going to be virtuous, you have to take yourself seriously. And if you start to understand that you're networked with other people, you're not one little dot among 7 billion, you're networked with other people, so you know 1,000 people and they know 1,000 people, and so you're 2 people away from 1 million people and 3 people away from 1 billion people. You're in a causal network and all of your actions matter. And Solzhenitsyn said there's as many centers of the universe as there are individual consciousnesses. And that's a very interesting way to think, and why can't it be that way? We don't know anything about consciousness, and it certainly seems to be how it feels if you're one of those conscious centers, and so maybe it is that what you do matters. I think that often people come to the conclusion that life is meaningless because that's a better conclusion to come to than the reverse. Because if life is meaningless, well, then who cares what you do? But if life is meaningful, if what you do matters, then everything you do matters. And that puts a terrible responsibility on the individual. And I think that people are generally unwilling to bear that. So life is suffering. What does that do to people? It makes them resentful. These are pitfalls of being. He said being has a structure. One of its fundamental structural elements is suffering, but suffering produces other characteristics of being. Resentment is a characteristic of being. People feel resentful when they believe that they've been taken advantage of. And maybe if you feel resentful, it may be that you're being taken advantage of. It may also be that you should screw your head on straight and look at things properly. And it may also be that you should talk to somebody to find out if you're being taken advantage of, or if your head just isn't screwed on straight. But to talk to them, then you have to tell them the truth, and in order to tell them the truth, you have to have practiced being honest. Because if you haven't practiced being honest, then you're not going to have a friend you can talk to, and even if you did, you won't be able to tell them what the problem is. And then they won't be able to help you sort out whether or not you're being taken advantage of, or whether you're a little bit insane. If you're resentful, then maybe you have to tell the person who's taking advantage of you that they should stop doing that. And maybe you have to tell them in a way that will make them stop, which is no easy thing. Or maybe you're resentful because you're a nasty little bit of the world, and you have a chip on your shoulder, and no matter what people do with you, you're resentful, in which case you have some internal restructuring to do. And you might ask, well, why should you do the restructuring? And the answer to that is that, well, resentment, along with hopelessness and nihilism and all sorts of other moral pitfalls, puts you on the road to cruelty and atrocity. Misery loves company. And if you feel that things are fundamentally unjust and that the slings and arrows of being are aimed specifically at you, why should you treat anyone else with compassion or justice? Because things are fundamentally unfair. And even more deeply, why shouldn't you conclude that things should be eradicated because fundamentally they're unfair? Now, I think that's what Hitler concluded. I also think that's what Stalin concluded. The evidence suggests that Stalin was gearing up for the Third World War. I mean, he had hydrogen bombs. He'd already killed 30 million people. I mean, he had his practice trials. And there's an old psychoanalytic idea, and the idea is, if you can't understand the motivations for the behavior, look at the outcome and infer the motivations. And so, Hitler killed 100 million people if you include the whole Second World War, and God only knows how many Stalin killed, and Mao killed more than Stalin. Why? Well, their cover story was utopia, and I guess people believed that. Well, why? It didn't look very utopian when all those millions of people were dying. I think all those people who participated in those processes used their rational utopianism as a cover story for their willingness to participate in the atrocity. Because what they wanted to do was participate in the atrocity. They didn't give a damn about utopia. Then you ask yourself, well, how much do you try to force the world to behave according to your terms? The Catholics have always had trouble with rationality, and modern people, especially the sort of hyper-atheists that you hear from now and then, really don't like that because they believe that rationality is the highest virtue, and that's wrong. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say in a university, except maybe the university isn't here to teach you to be rational. Maybe it's here to teach you to be virtuous, and those aren't the same thing. And the rational person says, well, I understand, and having understood, I impose an order, and then I work to make that imposed order a reality. That's what every ideologue does. It's what every utopian does. It's convincing, and I think the reason that people do that is because it's complicated. Partly they want an explanation for their being, but more importantly than that, they want a mask that covers up their tendency to atrocity with the appearance of virtue. And most utopian thinking is of that sort, even though the mask can be very well argued. And you ask me why I believe that, and the reason I believe that is because we had 100 years of it, and that's how it turned out. One of the things that was terrible about living in the Soviet Union was that you couldn't suffer because things were perfect. So if you were suffering, and you even admitted it, then you were instantly an enemy of the state. So if you're an ideologue, your own suffering makes you a heretic, right? You undermine your belief in your own bloody system by suffering. Well, and that's fine. If your belief has stopped you from suffering, well, more power to you. But if you're still suffering a bit, or a lot, or a tremendous amount, then you can ask yourself, maybe there's something I don't know. Here's an existential exercise. So, and this is not rational. You say, let's assume that virtue is worth pursuing. And I say it's worth pursuing because a virtuous path is the only path that justifies being to itself. That's the definition of virtue. A virtuous path justifies being to itself. Being is suffering. So you need a justification for your suffering. So then you might ask yourself, are there times in my life when I feel that my suffering is justified? And this is a good question. And you could ask yourself the reverse question too, which is, are there times in my life when my suffering is clearly not justified? And I could say, well, watch yourself for 3 weeks. Just watch, like you don't know anything. And see when you're somewhere that justifies itself. Now, you might say, well, how do I know? And I'd say, okay, well, here's some hints. You're not self-conscious. You know, it's not good to be self-conscious, right? It loads on neuroticism. It's a negative emotion. I mean, we think of it as a higher order cognitive function, but people find it unpleasant. You tend to be self-conscious when you're false or shamed. If you're deeply engaged in something, your self-consciousness disappears. So engagement in something meaningful seems to make self-consciousness vanish. It also makes time vanish, right? Because if you're doing something that is intrinsically meaningful, then the sense of passing time disappears. And so that temporal limitation that plagues you vanishes. And I could say, maybe you're having a miserable time of it and you only spend 2% of your waking hours in that condition. And maybe you don't even know when that is, but you could watch, you could see, and you could say, hey, look, wow, I spent 10 minutes there, I hardly even noticed, and I felt that the nature of my being justified itself. Well, maybe you wouldn't say that to yourself, but you could. You could say, that was worth it. And then I could say, well, practice that. Above all else, forget about everything else. And then there's an alternative exercise. Pay attention and figure out when absolutely your being does not justify itself. That's even easier, you know, because that'll happen whenever you do something that you immediately regret or are ashamed of, or that, even more precisely, makes you feel disintegrated and devalued. Nietzsche said people betray themselves for the sake of their good name all the time. You can feel this. It seems to center in your solar plexus. When you say something or do something that is not virtuous, then you'll disintegrate and then you're weak, and you can feel that, and then you'll cover it up with a bunch of rattling arguments trying to convince yourself and other people that what you were doing was actually okay. But you know, and it's your rational arrogance and authoritarianism that forces you not to drop your stupid presuppositions and just pay attention to what your being is revealing to you. We don't think that way. We don't think being reveals things. It reveals things all the time, we just don't pay any attention. Why? Well, I think we don't want the responsibility. I really believe, I've thought about this for a long time, I really believe that that's the case. Here's a quote from the Tao Te Ching. I have a great translation of this book. It was written by Lao Tzu years and years ago. It's one of the world's classics of literature. The person who wrote this wasn't a philosopher. The person who wrote this was a master of being. That's a different thing, because a philosopher thinks, but a master of being doesn't think. Because thinking is a tool, and being is something that supersedes any tool. He said, "It is by sheathing intellect's bright light that the sage remains at one with his own self, ceasing to be aware of it, by placing it behind